The driver woke up before the sun, as he always did. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when the world is still asleep. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, letting his feet rest on the cold floor, and took a slow breath. Another long day was waiting, and he wanted to start it calmly. He washed his face, fixed his hair, and put on his clean but worn uniform. The fabric had faded with time, but it was neat. He made sure the buttons were closed properly, and that his shoes, though old, were clean. Before leaving, he looked around the small room. Nothing fancy, just the basics. A simple life, built on routine and patience. He locked the door behind him and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the sky was slowly changing color. He liked this time of day. It reminded him that every day starts the same way for everyone, no matter who they are. At the transport yard, the driver greeted the guard with a nod. He didn't talk much, but he was polite. He checked the vehicle carefully, walking around it, making sure everything was in order. Tires, lights, doors. He treated the vehicle with care, almost like a partner. This was his responsibility, and he took it seriously. That morning, he was assigned a special job. A group of important guests needed to be driven to a high-end hotel for a business event. The paper said the pickup location and the time. Nothing else. The driver folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. To him, a job was a job. He didn't think much about who the passengers were. He arrived early at the pickup point as usual. The place was busy, with people and expensive clothes coming and going. He parked in the correct spot and waited. He sat straight, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes forward. Minutes passed. Then voices began to approach. The group arrived together, talking loudly and laughing. Their clothes were sharp and costly. Watches shined on their wrists. Phones were held high, calls being made without care for who was listening. As they got closer to the vehicle, their voices grew sharper. One of them looked at the car and frowned. He said something about the vehicle not being new enough. Another laughed and said it was good enough for a driver like this. They hadn't even stepped inside yet, and already the tone was clear. The driver stepped out and opened the door for them as he was trained to do. He greeted them politely and waited. They barely looked at him. One walked past without a word. Another brushed by him, bumping his shoulder slightly, without apology. The driver said nothing. He simply closed the door carefully once they were inside. As the car started moving, the talking began again. They spoke about deals, money, and people they looked down on. Sometimes their words drifted toward the front seat. "Did you see his shoes?" One of them said with a laugh. "Probably older than the car," another replied. They laughed openly, not lowering their voices. They spoke as if the driver wasn't even there, as if he couldn't hear them, or as if it didn't matter if he did. The driver kept his eyes on the road. His face showed no anger, no sadness, just calm focus. He had heard worse before. Years of driving had taught him one important thing. Silence is sometimes stronger than words. Traffic was slow, steady. The driver knew the roads well and chose the smoothest route. He avoided sudden stops and sharp turns. Still, one of the passengers complained. "Can you drive any slower?" the voice said sharply. "We have an important event to attend." The driver spoke softly, respectfully. He explained that traffic was heavy, but they would arrive on time. The response was a short laugh. "Of course you'd say that," someone muttered. The driver said nothing more. As the vehicle moved through the city, people on the streets hurried to their own lives. Street vendors set up their stalls. Office workers checked their watches. Students waited for buses. The driver noticed these things. He always did. He liked observing the world quietly, without being part of the noise. Behind him, the group continued talking. Their words were full of pride. They spoke about success as if it belonged only to them. They spoke about others as if people were numbers, not lives. At one point, the driver slowed slightly to avoid a sudden obstacle on the road. A sharp voice came immediately. "Watch where you're going." The driver nodded slightly, though no one was looking at him. He adjusted the steering and continued. Inside, he felt no need to explain himself further. He had learned long ago that some people don't listen, no matter how clear the truth is. As they neared the hotel, the building rose tall and bright ahead. Glass reflected the morning light. Cars lined the entrance. Valets moved quickly, opening doors, greeting guests with wide smiles. The driver parked carefully in the assigned area. He turned off the engine and stepped out. He walked around to open the doors for the passengers. One of them stepped out and stretched, looking around with satisfaction. Another adjusted his jacket and glanced at the driver with clear dislike. "This is the car they sent us?" One said loudly, making sure others nearby could hear. People at the entrance began to glance over. The driver stood quietly, hands clasped in front of him. He waited for instructions, just as he was trained. One man shook his head and continued speaking loudly. He complained about the ride, the traffic, and then the driver himself. He said the driver didn't know how to do his job. He said people like him should be grateful just to be allowed near places like this. The words cut through the air. A few bystanders slowed down, listening. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply watched. The driver opened his mouth once, calmly, to explain about the traffic and the safe driving choices he had made. But the man waved his hand dismissively. "No excuses," he said. "Just do what you're paid to do." The driver closed his mouth and nodded once. He lowered his head slightly, not in shame, but in control. He knew when speaking would only make things worse. A phone was raised somewhere nearby. Someone was recording. The driver noticed, but did not react. His face remained calm. The group moved toward the hotel entrance, still talking, still laughing. One of them threw a final comment over his shoulder, something meant to hurt, something unnecessary. The driver stayed where he was for a moment after they left. He took a slow breath. He looked at the hotel doors, then at the ground, then back at the vehicle. His reflection showed in the glass, a simple man in a simple uniform. He did not feel anger. He did not feel the need to defend himself. What he felt was something quieter, a deep understanding of how easily people judge what they see, and how little they care to know what they don't. He returned to the driver's seat and waited. This was only the beginning of the day. In the beginning of something no one else could yet see. The driver remained near the vehicle as the group disappeared inside the hotel. The noise around him slowly returned to normal. Valets moved cars. Guests walked in and out. Conversations blended into the background. Life continued, as if nothing unusual had happened. After a few minutes, the driver received a message on his phone. It was simple. He was to wait until the group was done with their event. He put the phone back in his pocket and leaned lightly against the vehicle, keeping an eye on everything. Waiting was part of his job. He was good at it. Time passed slowly. The sun climbed higher, warming the entrance area. The driver adjusted his cap slightly and stood straight again. He noticed a young valet nearby who kept glancing at him. The valet looked unsure, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, the valet walked over. "They were rude," he said quietly. Almost apologetic, the driver looked at him and gave a small, calm smile. "It's all right," he replied. "Not everyone knows how to speak with respect." The valet nodded, clearly relieved, and returned to his work. Inside the hotel, the group had already forgotten about the driver. They sat in a private lounge, surrounded by soft lighting and polished furniture. Drinks were served. Laughter filled the space. They talked about business, about profits, about power. The earlier moment outside was just a joke to them now. Something to laugh about again. One of them mocked the way the driver had stood silently. Another imitated his calm voice. The group laughed loudly. No one stopped to think about why the driver hadn't reacted. To them, silence meant weakness. The event began soon after. Speakers took the stage. The group listened with half-interest, checking their phones, whispering comments to each other. They were confident, used to being important, used to being heard. Meanwhile, outside, the driver sat inside the vehicle to escape the heat. He rolled the window down slightly, letting air move through. From where he sat, he could see reflections of the building's glass walls. He watched people pass by, each carrying their own story, His mind drifted not to anger, but to memory. 2 moments long ago, when he had stood on different floors, in different rooms, wearing different clothes. Moments when people spoke to him very differently. He pushed the thoughts away gently. This was not the time for that. An hour passed. Then, another. A hotel staff member approached the vehicle and knocked lightly on the window. The driver opened the door and stepped out. "Sir," the staff member said politely, "are you waiting for the business group from the conference hall?" "Yes," the driver replied. "They asked if the car will be ready soon." "It's ready," the driver said simply. The staff member smiled and walked away. Not long after, the group returned to the entrance. Their mood was lighter now. Some looked pleased. Others looked tired. One complained loudly about the long speeches. Another said the event was still worth attending because of the connections. As they approached the vehicle, the driver stepped forward and opened the doors. Again, one of them stopped suddenly and looked at the driver closely. "Do you ever smile?" he asked, half joking, half mocking. The driver looked at him calmly. "I do," he said, "just not at everything." That answer caused brief silence. Then someone laughed and shook their head. "Figures," he said, and stepped inside. As the vehicle pulled away, traffic grew heavier. The city was busy now. Horns sounded. Pedestrians crossed streets hurriedly. The driver focused fully on the road soon. Frustration returned inside the car. "We're late." One voice complained. "You should have taken a different route." Another added, the driver explained. Again, calmly, that this was the fastest, safe way at the moment. He spoke clearly, without attitude. "Safe," someone repeated, laughing. "That's rich." The words were meant to insult. The driver let them pass. Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed. A vehicle ahead stopped unexpectedly. The driver reacted instantly, pressing the brakes smoothly, steering slightly to avoid a collision. The car stopped safely. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then one of them shouted, "What are you doing?" The driver took a breath. Another car stopped suddenly. He said, "We're safe." Instead of relief, anger followed. "You almost ruined everything," the voice snapped. The driver said nothing more. A few minutes later, the road cleared, and they continued. But the tension remained. The group whispered among themselves, clearly unhappy. They blamed the driver for stress they already carried. When they finally reached their next stop, a large office building, the group rushed out without thanks. One of them turned back and pointed a finger at the driver. "Wait here," he said sharply, "and don't disappear." The driver nodded. As they entered the building, a security officer approached the vehicle. He looked serious. "Is everything okay here?" the officer asked. "Yes," the driver replied calmly. "I received a complaint," the officer said. "They said you were driving recklessly." The driver's expression did not change. "I drove safely," he said. "No one was harmed." The officer studied him for a moment. He seemed unsure. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll note that," the officer said, and walked away. The driver sat back inside the vehicle. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and closed his eyes briefly. Not to escape, but to steady himself. He understood how quickly words could turn into trouble. Inside the building, the group spoke to management. They exaggerated the incident, making the drivers sound careless. They spoke with confidence, expecting immediate support. But something unexpected happened. One manager asked calmly, "Did anything actually happen?" They paused. "Well," no one admitted, "but it could have." The manager nodded slowly. "We'll look into it," he said. Outside, the driver waited again. He looked at the building entrance, then at the passing clouds above. He knew this situation could grow worse. He also knew that truth has a way of standing firm, even when pushed. A familiar face appeared near the entrance. A senior hotel manager stepped out, scanning the area. His eyes landed on the driver. He stared for a moment longer than necessary. The driver noticed the look, but did not react. The manager walked closer. Studying the driver's face, his posture, his calm presence, something stirred in his memory. Something he couldn't yet name. "Excuse me," the manager said carefully. "May I ask how long you've been driving?" The driver met his eyes. "Many years," he replied. The manager nodded slowly, still looking thoughtful. "And your name?" The driver answered quietly. The manager's expression changed, just slightly. Not enough for others to notice, but enough to suggest that this story was not what it seemed. The group inside the building continued talking, unaware that something was shifting outside, unaware that their words and actions were slowly leading them toward a truth they never expected. The driver returned to waiting, calm as ever. While the world around him began to rearrange itself in silence, the driver remained in the car as the city buzzed around him. Horns blared, people walked quickly on the sidewalks, and the sunlight reflected off glass windows. He kept his hands folded lightly on the steering wheel, waiting. Every detail of the city felt alive to him, but he did not let it disturb his calm. Inside the building, the group was finishing their meeting. They laughed among themselves, confident and unconcerned. Their minds were elsewhere. They had no idea that the driver outside, the man they had mocked without pause, had a quiet presence that would soon change the way they saw everything. Meanwhile, the senior hotel manager who had noticed the driver earlier began to act. He walked carefully toward the vehicle, his expression thoughtful. He had studied many people over the years. Something about this driver seemed different, almost familiar. Not just in the way he carried himself, but in the subtle confidence in his calmness. It reminded the manager of someone important he had met long ago. "Excuse me," the manager said as he approached the car. "May I speak with you for a moment?" The driver looked up and nodded politely. He opened the door, and the manager gestured for him to step aside for a private conversation. They moved a few meters away, speaking quietly. "I feel like I know you," the manager said cautiously. "Have we met before?" The driver smiled faintly. "Perhaps," he replied softly. "Many years ago." The manager's eyes narrowed slightly. He tried to place the face. It was familiar, but he could not remember where he had seen it. Something about the driver's manner, the quiet dignity in his posture, made the manager feel uneasy. It was as if the driver had a story that no one could guess. While this conversation happened quietly, the group inside the building was preparing to leave. Their laughter and chatter filled the lobby. They were oblivious to the fact that someone outside was beginning to recognize the truth about the man they had belittled. The thought never crossed their minds that he might not be an ordinary driver at all. Once the group exited, driver opened the doors again, his movements calm and precise. The passengers stepped into the car, their expressions still carrying faint traces of amusement. They had not expected to be spoken to be observed in any meaningful way. Their arrogance was still strong. Traffic was heavy again. The driver guided the car skillfully through the crowded streets. Every turn and stop was calculated, smooth, and controlled. He moved as if he knew exactly where he was going and what to expect, which he did. The group continued speaking, trying to dominate the atmosphere. One of them laughed at something trivial and then leaned back in the seat. Another commented on the driver's quiet nature. "Why is he always so serious?" one asked. "He's probably scared to make a mistake," another replied. "People like him think they're doing their best, but they never really know anything." The driver kept his eyes on the road. His face revealed nothing. He had learned long ago that people would often judge what they saw on the surface, without ever understanding what lay beneath. He knew that words and mockery were often the way people hid their own insecurities. Suddenly, reflection in a nearby building caught the driver's attention. In the glass, he saw the hotel manager watching him closely. The manager's expression was intense, trying to understand something that was just out of reach. The driver acknowledged him with a small nod, still calm. He did not need to speak. The manager had already noticed enough. The group noticed the car, slowing slightly at an intersection, and started complaining. "Can you drive any slower?" one shouted. The driver answered patiently, "We are waiting for the traffic to clear. It is safer this way." The response was a scoff, followed by a few sarcastic remarks. The passengers were growing more agitated, but the driver did not react. He simply adjusted his speed and continued, keeping both safety and calm in mind. As the car moved, the driver glanced briefly at the rearview mirror. He noticed that one of the passengers had grown quiet. She seemed uneasy, her eyes darting around, noticing things she hadn't before. Perhaps it was the calm, steady presence of the driver, or maybe the realization that not everything was as simple as it seemed. Either way, a small shift was happening in the minds of the group. The driver's thoughts drifted quietly. He thought about how people often rush to judge, how easily they overlooked the human behind the uniform. He had spent years learning to observe, to understand, and to remain patient. His life had taught him that dignity was not in the words you heard, but in the way you carried yourself in silence. Minutes passed, and the group's mood began to shift subtly. The woman who had grown quiet leaned back slightly, her expression more reflective. Another passenger began to notice the driver's calm demeanor and started to feel a flicker of guilt for their earlier behavior. Yet no one said anything out loud. The driver knew that change did not happen instantly. People needed time to see clearly, to understand, and sometimes they needed to experience the truth directly. He allowed the silence to stretch. He let his presence speak in ways words could not. The hotel manager, still watching, started to approach the group cautiously. He walked up to the driver's side, careful not to draw attention, and spoke softly. "Do you have a few minutes?" He asked. The driver nodded. Of course. They stepped aside once more, out of earshot of the passengers. The manager's eyes were wide with curiosity and caution. He wanted to confirm what his instincts told him, but feared he might be wrong. "I remember someone very much like you," the manager said. "Years ago, a man who worked tirelessly and quietly, who built something remarkable but never sought attention. Could it be?" The driver remained composed. "Perhaps," he said, his voice steady, "but it is not important who I am. What matters is the work, the patience, and the understanding." The manager nodded slowly. Something in the driver's words and demeanor resonated with him. He realized that there was far more to this man than the uniform suggested. He had always known that appearances could be deceiving, but he had never experienced it so clearly until now. Meanwhile, inside the car, the group was oblivious to the unfolding recognition. They continued their chatter, their arrogance still present, their laughter masking the subtle unease creeping in. The driver knew that the moment for revelation had not yet arrived. Patience was key. He allowed the journey to continue, careful, calm, and observant. Every turn of the wheels, every pause, every glance in the mirrors was part of a larger rhythm he had learned to follow as they drove. He noticed small things: a reflection in a shop window, a pedestrian's expression, a stray dog crossing the road. Each detail was a reminder that the world was alive, unpredictable, and full of lessons. The passengers continued their complaints and sarcastic remarks, unaware that the driver's quiet control and the manager's recognition were slowly shifting the balance. The truth they did not yet know was approaching quietly, almost imperceptibly, ready to change the way they saw the man they had belittled so easily by the time they approached the next destination. The tension had subtly grown. The group's energy was different now. Unease had replaced some of their laughter, though they could not yet understand why. The driver slowed as he approached the building, pulling up carefully. He opened the doors, allowing the passengers to step out. They moved quickly, slightly more cautious than before, their earlier confidence beginning to crack in ways they did not notice as they walked inside. The hotel manager remained outside, his gaze fixed on the driver. There was an unspoken understanding forming, a recognition of something profound. The driver's calmness, dignity, and patience had revealed a truth far deeper than anyone had expected. The driver returned to the car and adjusted his seat. He exhaled quietly, not out of relief, but as a preparation. The next moments, he knew, would bring the revelation that some people were not ready for, but that was part of the journey. Patience, quiet observation, and dignity were his companions, and he would see this through to the end. The driver continued to wait patiently, his hands lightly resting on the steering wheel. The city around him was alive with movement, but he remained calm, like a still point in the middle of chaos. The hotel manager stood nearby, his eyes fixed on the driver with quiet curiosity. Something was stirring, something that had been hidden for years. Inside the hotel, the group was preparing to leave for their next appointment. Their voices were loud and their laughter filled the hallway. They still believed they were in control of the situation, unaware that the driver's calm and composed presence outside was more than just professionalism. They assumed he was an ordinary driver, someone who could be ignored, belittled, and laughed at as they walked toward the exit. The senior hotel manager intercepted them with a calm authority they were not used to seeing. He motioned for them to pause. "Excuse me," the manager said, his tone steady. "There is something you should know before you leave." The group exchanged glances, slightly annoyed. They were not used to being questioned, and they certainly did not expect any kind of correction from someone they considered below their status. "What is it?" one of them asked impatiently. The manager's eyes shifted toward the driver. "The man outside, the one you have been mocking. He is not who you think he is." The group stopped abruptly, confusion and disbelief on their faces. They turned toward the driver, who remained calm, his expression neutral, his hands folded lightly in front of him. Their laughter, arrogance, and sense of superiority faltered. For the first time, they noticed him fully, really looked at him. "Excuse me?" one of them said, his voice shaky. "What do you mean he's not who we think he is?" The manager took a deep breath. "He is the original founder of the transport company you are using. Years ago, he built the business from nothing, grew it, and then chose to sell most of his shares. But instead of living a life of luxury, he returned to the streets, to the driver's seats, understand how the world treated people with less power. He wanted to see firsthand how employees and customers behaved when they thought no one important was watching." The room fell silent. The group could hardly believe what they were hearing. Their faces shifted through a mixture of shock, guilt, and disbelief. They looked at each other as if searching for confirmation before their eyes returned to the driver. He had not moved a muscle, not flinched, not raised his voice. He remained composed, quiet, and dignified. The truth settled heavily in the air. Words that had once been jokes, insults, and sarcasm now seemed shallow and foolish. They had mocked a man who had built something remarkable, who had chosen humility and understanding over power and wealth. And they had done it in public, in front of strangers, full confidence that they were right, and he was beneath them. One of them finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't know." The driver looked at them calmly, not with anger, but with a quiet strength. "You did not know," he said simply, "and that is why your words were misguided. But now you do." Another voice, still shaky, asked, "Why? Why would you do this? Why return as a driver?" The driver's eyes softened, and he smiled faintly. "I wanted to understand. To see how people treat each other without status or fear of consequence. Power can show who people truly are. Humility can reveal character. I wanted to witness it, to experience it, and to remind myself of what really matters." The group stood there, speechless. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, realizing the weight of their behavior. They had not just belittled a driver, they had underestimated a person's wisdom, patience, and life experience. Their arrogance had blinded them. The hotel manager, observing the scene, nodded slightly to the driver. He has shown more dignity in this moment than most would in a lifetime of wealth and privilege. The manager said softly. One of the passengers, a woman who had been quiet for most of the ride, finally found her voice. I am sorry," she said, her tone sincere. "I didn't realize. I didn't think." The driver nodded gently. "Apologies are accepted, but the lesson is yours to carry. Respect is not given by titles, money, or appearance. It is earned in how you treat others every day." The group looked at each other again, the reality sinking in. Their laughter was gone, replaced by quiet introspection. For some, it was a moment of shame. For others, a moment of awakening. The driver's calm presence had shifted the entire atmosphere. Outside, the sun reflected off the polished streets. The driver stepped lightly back into the vehicle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He did not gloat, did not speak harshly. His dignity and patience spoke louder than any words could. The group followed, still silent, as the car began to move again. This time, the atmosphere inside was different. They were not angry, not laughing, not mocking. They were reflective, aware that they had underestimated someone and that their behavior had consequences beyond what they had imagined. As they drove, the driver maintained his calm. He guided the vehicle skillfully, smoothly, each turn and stop precise and deliberate. His focus was on the road, on safety, and on teaching by example rather than force. The hotel manager watched from the entrance as the car disappeared into traffic. He smiled faintly to himself, recognizing that some lessons are taught not through words, but through presence, humility, and quiet action. The passengers remained mostly silent for the rest of the ride. Occasionally, one would glance at the driver, seeing him anew, realizing the depth of character they had overlooked. The laughter, the arrogance, the assumptions they had all faded. In their place grew respect, understanding, and a quiet sense of humility. By the time they reached their final destination, the group had changed. Not completely, not instantly, but enough that the world they had known seemed slightly altered. They understood in a way that true power is not in wealth, status, or loud words. True power is in dignity, patience, and the quiet strength of a person who chooses to understand rather than dominate. The driver parked carefully. He opened the doors, allowing the passengers to step out. They moved slowly this time, aware of the man before them, aware of the lesson they had learned without words. Without argument, without drama, some of them tried to speak, offering belated apologies, words of respect, but the driver simply nodded, accepting without dwelling. He had shown them the truth, and now it was theirs to carry. As they walked away, the driver remained by the vehicle, calm, composed, and dignified. The city moved on around him, but he remained a quiet anchor in a world of assumptions, judgments, and fleeting arrogance. His presence had revealed a deeper truth. Respect and character are not earned by appearance or status, but by how one lives and acts when no one is watching. The hotel manager lingered for a moment, watching the driver, and then turned to return inside. He knew he had witnessed something rare, something that would stay with him for a long time. The driver had revealed a truth no one expected, and it had changed the course of that day for everyone involved. And as the vehicle disappeared into traffic once more, the driver remained the same, quiet, patient, and dignified man he had always been. A living example that true character cannot be belittled, underestimated, or ignored. The driver continued his work quietly after the group had left. The day had been long, but the events that unfolded had left a subtle change in the air. He returned to the streets, driving through the familiar paths he had learned by heart over the years. Every turn, every stop, every glance in the mirrors was done with care, precision, and a calmness that had become his hallmark. The city around him continued to move at its usual pace. Street vendors called out for customers. Children ran past on their way home from school. Office workers hurried, talking on phones or discussing meetings. The driver noticed all these details, small and ordinary, and found beauty in them. It reminded him that life was made up of such moments, each carrying its own weight and meaning. As he drove, he reflected on the events of the day. The passengers who had belittled him had learned a lesson they did not expect. He did not feel pride in their realization, nor did he feel revenge. What he felt was quiet satisfaction, a sense of fulfillment in knowing that patience, dignity, and understanding had spoken louder than any harsh words could. Later, the driver stopped for a short break. He stepped out of the vehicle, stretching lightly. The sun was beginning to lower, casting a warm glow over the streets. He watched people pass by, each absorbed in their own lives. Some glanced at him briefly, probably noticing the uniform, but most were caught in their own worlds. He smiled faintly, a small acknowledgement of the lives intersecting around him. As he resumed driving, he noticed a familiar figure ahead. It was the senior hotel manager, walking with purpose. Their eyes met, and the manager offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the day's events. The driver returned the gesture, calm and composed. There was no need for words. The understanding was mutual. The rest of the day continued in a rhythm the driver had grown accustomed to. Pickups and drop-offs, greetings and goodbyes, all handled with the same quiet care. Each person he interacted with received respect, regardless of their status or attitude. This was his way of living, a principle that guided him through the challenges of his work and his life. Evening arrived, and the streets began to empty slightly. The driver took a route that allowed him to enjoy the softer sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the wind. These moments of calm reminded him why he had chosen this life, why he had returned to the streets, why he valued patience and observation above all else. As he reached the final pickup of the day, a young woman approached the car. She was polite, and her demeanor was respectful. Unlike the group earlier, she greeted him with a smile, clearly unaware of the lessons of the day. The driver returned her greeting with a gentle nod. The ride was smooth and quiet. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with curiosity and interest, not arrogance. The driver answered with care, sharing information only when necessary. The conversation was simple, human, and meaningful. It reminded him that while some people needed to learn lessons through experience, others approached life with a natural openness that made his job fulfilling. When he reached her destination, she thanked him sincerely. The driver smiled faintly and wished her well. There was no sense of superiority in his actions, only a calm recognition that respect is given through behavior, not words. She walked away, leaving the driver to continue his journey through the quieting streets. Later, as night settled over the city, he returned to the transport yard. The day had been long and filled with small dramas, but none had shaken his composure. He checked the vehicle once more, ensuring everything was in place for the next day. The car was more than just a vehicle to him. It was a partner in his work. It's a tool to navigate life with care and responsibility. The driver reflected on the lessons of the day. He thought about the group that had belittled him, about their reactions, and about the subtle changes he had observed. He knew that some lessons are slow to take root, but he also knew that the truth has a way of emerging. Even when hidden by arrogance and assumption, he left the vehicle and walked to a small bench nearby. The city lights glowed softly, casting long shadows across the pavement. He sat down for a moment, letting his mind rest. The quiet of the evening was comforting, a time to reflect and prepare for the next day. In the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of people returning home, of life continuing in its ordinary rhythm. He understood that this was the world he had chosen to engage with, not through wealth or status, but through simple, honest work and observation. His life was a testament to the power of patience, dignity, and the quiet strength that comes from understanding human nature. As he stood to leave, he glanced once more at the vehicle, then at the streets stretching ahead. Each day would bring new people, new challenges, and new lessons. He would face them all with the same calm and respect that had guided him throughout his life. The driver walked away from the bench, the night cool against his face. The city around him continued to hum with life, but he carried a quiet sense of fulfillment. The lessons of the day, the revelations, the subtle changes in the people he had encountered, they all reinforced a truth he had always known: respect. Understanding and dignity are never determined by appearances. They are determined by actions, patience, and the quiet strength to remain composed in the face of arrogance. The driver disappeared into the night, blending into the rhythm of the city. His story, though unseen by most, had made a mark on those who had crossed his path. The group that once mocked him would carry the memory of the truth he had revealed. And in the quiet, ordinary moments of life, the driver continued his work. Unchanged in his humility, unwavering in his patience, and steadfast in his understanding of what truly matters.